Kellen Winslow is a man who has been given much. He reached the top heights of his profession. He reportedly has earned over $40 million himself as a football player. He was born the son of a man who himself had achieved great heights in his profession. Mr. Winslow, the defendant in this case, has been given much, but it was not enough. You will learn over the course of the next few weeks that Kellen Winslow took what he wanted. He took what he wanted, not from one, not from two, but 3 women. He victimized 5 women. 5 separate women who knew nothing of each other, who had never met one another, who were either complete and total strangers to Kellen Winslow, or who had only recently met him and had fleeting interactions with him. Over the course of this trial, you will hear from each one of those 5 women, and you will see what this defendant took. It wasn't enough for Mr. Winslow to be given what he had in life. Instead, he took from these women. This is the defendant in court. You see him before you today, and he's been in court for numerous pretrial hearings. So have multiple victims. You will hear about prior testimony. You will hear about prior statements. And ultimately, at the end of this case, I am confident that you will decide this defendant's guilt for each and every one of the charges. Kellen Winslow on the left in his DMV photograph, Kellen Winslow in the middle when he was contacted by police, and Kellen Winslow on the right when he had been arrested and brought to justice. The same man who sits before you today, and the same man who committed these crimes against these 5 separate women. This is Kellen Winslow in June of 2018. As you can see in the center, the left and the right, that is the Kellen Winslow that was out on the streets of Encinitas committing his crimes. As you can see, the extensive tattooing on his left arm and on his right. Ladies and gentlemen, you will learn over the course of this case that this is not a question of whether or not he was the person involved in these crimes, but rather what the crimes are. And I submit to you that the crimes that have been brought in this case, as it relates to Jane Doe 1, are kidnapped for rape and oral copulation, rape by force or fear, and oral copulation by force or fear. That's one of the first bits of information that you heard about when you were first brought to court. When you were prospective jurors, now you've been sworn in and impaneled and will be the ones who will be deciding this case. Jane Doe 2, counts 4 and 5, are rape by force or fear and sodomy by force or fear. And I'm going to give you an overview of the evidence as it relates to both Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2, and what they have said this defendant did to them. You're also going to hear about Jane Doe 3. In May of last year, a neighbor to Mr. Winslow, unknown to this victim, but a woman who again had something taken from her, when the defendant decided that he wanted to target her, just as he had targeted Jane Doe 1 and targeted Jane Doe 2 in the weeks and months before. And that he exposed himself to her as she cried out for her husband. You're going to hear about Jane Doe 4. Jane Doe 4, as you've heard already, is a 17-year-old girl who's now grown, married, a mother, 15 years removed from what had happened to her when she was still a child, 15 years removed from what the defendant had done to her when he was 19. Well, you will hear about the way in which Mr. Winslow raped her back in 2003. You will likewise hear from Jane Doe 5. Jane Doe 5 is a 77-year-old woman who, while engaged in her regular routine of going to the gym with her husband in Carlsbad at a Crunch Fitness near Palomar Airport Road off of El Camino Real, where this defendant, this man on trial, this man sitting in court before you, touched his own penis, stroked his own penis, rubbed his own penis, and asked her if she liked it. Asked her if she could see it as he stood before her. You will hear that that wasn't the one and only time she had an interaction with this defendant, but that weeks later, he again got into a hot tub next to her with nothing but a towel on, and he masturbated next to her. A 77-year-old woman. Again, 5 women, unknown to each other, barely known to the defendant. All of them have come forward to tell you about his deeds. And I ask you to judge him by his deeds, not who he is and not who his father is. Jane Doe's 1 and 2. Jane Doe 1 on the left, Jane Doe 2 on the right. Jane Doe 3. Jane Doe 5. This defendant took from each of them. And here is Jane Doe 4. As you can see, pictured with Jane Doe 4, our 17-year-old victim, is undoubtedly Kellen Winslow. Again, it's not a question whether or not he's the person who committed these crimes. You're going to hear from Jane Doe 4, and she's going to tell you why she retained that photograph. She's going to tell you why she kept it. And she's going to tell you that the reason why she kept it was because she wanted something to remember. Something to remember and remind herself that anything can happen to you, even when you feel safe. That the worst of things can happen to you, despite any protections you may think you have. So let's start with Jane Doe 1. On St. Patrick's Day, on March 17th of last year, 2018, she stated that she was hitchhiking on Santa Fe Drive near Lake Drive, that she lives with a family member in the area, but she's frequently on the streets. That while she was walking that late afternoon and asking for a ride from anyone who would pass by, she walked westbound on Santa Fe near Lake Drive. Lake Drive is going to be a particularly important location in the city of Encinitas. In fact, Mr. Winslow himself lives at 1310 Lake Drive. You're going to hear that what she described as a black, square-shaped Jeep with a hard top pulled up alongside of her. She was thumbing a ride, and she saw a driver who, at least initially, appeared to be nice. She was not intimidated by him. She described him as being half black, half Caucasian. He had short and curly hair. He was muscular, and he had tattoos on both of his arms, extending from his wrists up to his shoulders. Certainly consistent with the description of Mr. Winslow as you've seen from the photographs. That initially, when she got into the car, she just asked for a short ride down to coastal Encinitas, where she would go shopping on Coast Highway. She said she was tired from walking and she just didn't want to walk anymore, so she asked for a ride. That she got into Mr. Winslow's vehicle, that they began to have friendly and small talk, that they were just talking about what are your plans for St. Patrick's Day. You're going to hear that on that same day, as they began to ride down the road on Santa Fe, they had began to pass San Diego High School, the academy that's right there. That as they passed the high school, she noticed that the defendant's demeanor changed, and she became concerned for her safety. Yes, she had just gotten into a car with a stranger. She'd never seen the person before. She was thumbing a ride. She thought she'd be okay. She never would have expected what happened to her. That as the defendant's attitude changed, he then told her, "I'm going to fuck you. And if you say anything, I will kill you. This defendant's own words. You'll hear her describe as she continued down westbound on Santa Fe that after the defendant had said that, it was as he was passing the 7-Eleven that's there on the northwest corner, right as you approach the 5 freeway. And you're going to hear that she began to protest with him, plead with him. Pull over right here. Don't take me over there. She begged him, let me out right here, as they passed the hospital, Scripps Hospital in Encinitas, and went under the freeway overpass. That the defendant then made a left-hand turn to drive into a shopping center where there's a Vons and a 24-hour fitness. That becomes important in this case. He drove to the rear of that shopping center, alongside the freeway, and as he parked the car, he repeatedly said to her, I'm going to fuck you. She was scared. She was afraid. She's going to tell you that the defendant told her, if you don't do whatever I want you to, I'm going to kill you right here. I don't care who's going to watch. I'm going to kill you. She said she was too afraid to scream. She knew that she was going to die. She was afraid. You're going to hear from Jane Doe 1 that this is the location where she was taken. As you can see, it's the rear side of a parking lot from the vantage point alongside the 5 freeway. And you can see that there's some dirt along the side of that parking lot, that there's some ice plant that's there, and it slopes upwards towards the 5 freeway southbound on-ramp. You're going to hear that when she got there, the defendant stopped his car. He had threatened her. He had instilled fear in her. She believed she was going to die. She was afraid that this man who she had never met before after he had made these threats had either a knife or a gun and that he was going to use it. So she complied. She was in survival mode. She did what he told her to do. A man much larger, much stronger, much more imposing than she could ever hope to be. She'll tell you, I can't tell you why I didn't run. I can't tell you why I didn't scream. I was that scared. But she remembers thinking she did not want to die. So she listened and did what defendant told her to do. He told her to get out of the car. He told her to go over the fence, and go over to that dirt side near the freeway. That once they had gotten over the fence, over along that ice plant that I showed you, that the defendant told her to take clothes off. She began to remove her pants. She was scared. She said that she could see cars driving by on the freeway, and she even had that moment, that thought, that he was going to throw her into the freeway when he was done with her. And then she's going to tell you that he changed his mind. She doesn't know if he saw something, saw someone, or that someone saw them, that he changed his mind and he told her to get back in the car. So she did. She followed his instructions because she was scared. She got back into his SUV, back over the fence, as you can see here, and into that parking lot. And that when she got into the front passenger seat of the defendant's car, he then told her, she began to plead again, I won't say anything if you just let me go right now. Nobody will ever know. Again, she was in survival. The defendant said, no, I'll fucking kill you. I'm going to fuck you right here. And he removed what he was wearing, which she described as workout spandex, or what wrestlers would wear, that extends up over his shoulders all the way down to his thighs. And he exposed his penis. And she's going to describe it in detail. He was erect. He was large. And he told her to perform oral sex on him. And she's going to tell you that she did. That she was afraid of what would happen if she did it. You're going to hear that after what she estimated to be about 2 minutes or so of performing oral sex on him, she couldn't really do that. Physically, she was unable to do that. And that the defendant then pinned her down, crawled on top of her as she sat in the front passenger seat, hurt her with the weight of his legs, placed his foot on her thigh, pinned her down to where she could feel the pain of his pressure, the weight of his body, and then he raped her. That he raped her vaginally. That she doesn't know how long it lasted, but it wasn't that long. But she just remembers feeling the pain. The pain of having this man inside her when she did not want him there. The pain that she felt was so tremendous that she said she felt herself begin to bleed. That it was when she began to bleed and she was not menstruating, but that as she began to bleed, the defendant just stopped. She thinks that may be why, but ultimately when he stopped raping her, he told her to get out of the car. When he told her to get out of the car, she did. He said, "Get out, get the fuck out." And he just immediately drove off. She said that when she first got out of the car, she screamed. She thinks she screamed, because that's what she knew she needed to do. And she ran to check to make sure that he was gone. And he was. The next thing she did is she went and tried to find a bathroom, a restroom. And she did. And then she walked alone to the bus depot, where she eventually got on the bus and left the area. You're going to hear that she was scared. She was afraid of what would happen to her. She believed that this man would carry out his threats to kill her if she ever said anything. If she just wanted it to be over. You're going to hear that 4 days later, on March 21st, 2018, that she did decide that she needed to report what the defendant had done to her. She did not know this man. She did not know who he was. She did not know where he was from. And she was afraid, but she still came forward. She had the strength and courage to report it. When she did report it, she walked into the San Diego Sheriff's Station, the substation there in Encinitas, which is known as the North Coastal Station. She called 911 to say that she needed to file a report. She walked right in, and she did. And she told them what this man had done to her. She did not know him as Kellen Winslow. She did not know the specific car that he drove. She did not have any other information about him. Just the description that I gave you. And you're going to hear that she was consistent about where she was picked up, where she was taken, what he had said to her, what she had said to him, and what he had done to her. And it's going to be for you to ultimately decide if you believe her when you've heard all of the evidence in this case. You're going to hear that after she had reported these crimes, that after she had come forward, that she chose, as is her right, to not have a sexual assault examination done. It was 4 days removed from the date of the crime. She elected not to. But she did provide the pants that she had been wearing as well as the underwear that she had been wearing to law enforcement. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear that those pants, in what could only be described at that point in time as a stranger rape with a general physical description of a suspect and a suspect vehicle, that those pants provided the evidence that was needed to identify the perpetrator. You're going to hear that those pants had reddish, brownish stain consistent with blood on them, that the forensic analyst from the San Diego Crime Laboratory, Kelly Hensley, who will be testifying as early as tomorrow morning, will tell you that she processed those pants, and that in the interior crotch portion of the pants that she was wearing the day that the defendant had raped her, she took cuttings, and as you can see from these photographs, the cuttings were from the interior lining of the pants directly adjacent to her vaginal area. And you will hear that those 4 areas were cut and extracted together. And as you can see from this diagram, they were cut in order to search for any detectable sperm. That once the 4 cuttings were taken from the pants, that they went through what's called the differential extraction process. You're going to hear from the DNA analyst who's going to tell you that differential extraction is one of the methodologies in DNA analysis, specifically in sexual assault cases, because it's useful to be able to isolate the sperm cell from any and other genetic material that may be contained within those pants cuttings. And that they used that process in this particular case to determine if they were going to be able to have any verifiable, detectable DNA. And they did. The differential extraction process is a chemical process where they remove a portion of the mixed stain. The perpetrator's sperm is mixed with the victim's epithelial cells, as you can imagine. They break open the vaginal, oral, and blood cells in a centrifuge, which then leads the sperm pellets to drop, and they remove what's known as the supernatant, which would be all the other epithelial cells or other genetic materials. They separate those 2 portions of the sample into a sperm fraction and a non-sperm fraction. Once they've removed the residual non-sperm DNA, they then have the separate sperm fraction from within the material that was found inside her pants. And make no mistake, it was this man sitting before you. It was a 1-to-1 match of the sperm fraction on those pant cuttings, which means that this defendant's semen was on that woman and inside her pants. You're going to hear during the course of testimony that Jane Doe 1 was unable to identify her perpetrator, that she was unable to identify him in court, and that she was unable to identify him in a 6-pack lineup. But ladies and gentlemen, the science tells all. It was this man who raped her in the way that she described. Turning to Jane Doe 2. She actually had prior interactions with the defendant, and she knew him, or at least remembered his name, to be Kevin. Incredibly similar to his name, Kellen. That one day, months prior to when she was violently raped, she was walking along El Camino Real when the defendant pulled up alongside of her and offered her a ride to a homeless shelter. And she will tell you that she's living on the streets of Encinitas. She'll tell you that she did not have a home. She'll tell you where she used to hang out, where she used to spend time, day in, day out, night in, night out. And she'll tell you that the defendant was friendly. He was nice. But she accepted that ride in a black Hummer. As she got into his car, they made small talk, and he dropped her off at a homeless shelter. She'll tell you that there were other occasions where the defendant pulled up and found her in the coastal area of Encinitas, in the Coast Highway in Vulcan. And he would ask her, "Do you need anything? Are you okay?" He would offer her food, offer her money, and she would always respectfully decline, but he always seemed nice. As he further ingratiated himself, she began to trust him. That on one occasion, he even offered her $50 for sex, and she said no. She said she's not that kind of girl. And as you'll see when she testifies, she most certainly is not. You're going to hear that on May 13th of 2018, less than 2 months removed from the incident involving Jane Doe 1, it was Mother's Day. She estimated it was around 8 or 9 p.m., sometime within that time frame, and that the defendant pulled up near the Encinitas train station where she was spending some time with 2 friends. that the two friends were sitting there, they were talking, they were engaged in their own conversation, and then she saw the defendant pull up. So she got up and went over to him and had a conversation. The defendant asked her if she wanted dinner, if she would go with him. And she declined. She said no, she had already eaten. Then he asked her, well, how about a cup of coffee? And she thought that he was being nice. She thought that she could have a cup of coffee that night. Again, she's out on the streets. She accepted a ride from a relative stranger. When she accepted that ride, she says that she felt very safe with him. But that sense of safety went away. Because the defendant drove away, and he passed by the coffee shop that she thought that they were going to. He passed by the Denny's that she thought that they were going to. He drove her from the train station in Encinitas, eastbound on Encinitas Boulevard, all the way over to El Camino Real, passed down to Manchester. And that while driving down Manchester is when she realized she was being taken somewhere she did not want to go. She thought maybe, in her own mind, trying to rationalize what was happening, maybe he's taking her to a different Denny's, as she'll describe it. Maybe the one down in Del Mar. But that he wasn't saying anything to her, and she was afraid. She tried to make small talk with him. She tried to talk to him to see what was going on, but he said nothing. Until he pulled over to the side of the road on Manchester. She remembers it being dark, and she remembers there being dirt on the roadside. And she remembers hearing cars pass by, but never seeing me. And she's going to tell you that once he pulled over to the side of the road, she was now scared to death. She was fearful. She was afraid. But the defendant got out of the car, and she locked the doors because she knew not what to do. But the defendant stood outside of the passenger door of his Hummer, and he laughed at her, and he showed her the keys, and he unlocked the door. That he then said, "We're going to have sex." She pled with him. She said, "No, please don't do this." Repeatedly. He said, "It's a done deal. You have no choice." He grabbed her by the wrist, he pulled her out of the car, and he held her arms. She believed she was going to be killed, and she had no way out. You're going to hear that he told her to take off her clothes, and that she did not struggle, because he was so strong and grabbed her so forcefully. She was afraid of what he was going to do. She said, "I was in survival mode." And the defendant raped her right there on the roadside along the side of his Hummer. You're going to hear that while he was raping her, that he anally penetrated her. She does not know if he did it on purpose, but that she felt the force of his penis enter her anus. And she screamed from the pain. It hurt her to the point that she screamed when all she wanted to happen in that moment was for it to end. And yet the pain was so strong that she cried out. And what happened when she did? The defendant grabbed her neck with both his hands and choked her, and told her, "If you scream, I will kill you." You're going to hear that she at first couldn't breathe. He grabbed her so hard by the neck. She finally said back to him, "If you don't hurt me, I won't scream." So he released her neck and continued to rape her. That he raped her until he stopped and ejaculated into the dirt alongside of her. She felt the pain as he raped her, and she felt the sadness as she believed in that moment when he was done, that she, too, would have her life end. She thought she was going to die in that moment. The defendant told her to put her clothes on, and they drove off. She thought he was going to take her back to where he had picked her up, but instead, he kicked her out of the car along the side of the road on Manchester, which then leads up towards El Camino Real. And you're going to hear that he told her, if you tell anybody, I will murder you. He left her on the side of the road, and she walked through the night alone all the way to coastal Encinitas. That she'll tell you that she was afraid that he was coming back for her. She was afraid that he was going to find her. And that she even went and sat in a taco shop by herself because it was a well-lit area. She was afraid of what was going to happen to her. That the next morning, she went and met another friend of hers, the same woman she had been with the night before, the woman who had borrowed her phone that night so that Jane Doe 2 did not have a phone on her own person. You're going to hear that she was talking to that woman and she was clearly emotional, upset by something, and that the woman could tell something was wrong. This woman's name is Christina Garvey. She herself is likewise transient. And Christina Garvey is the woman who could tell that something had happened to Jane Doe 2, and is the first person that Jane Doe 2 disclosed what the defendant had done to her. You're going to hear that Jane Doe 2, through the encouragement of her friend, reported it that same morning. She went to the sheriff's department and told them what the defendant had done to her. You're going to hear that while she knew him as Kevin, she knew enough about him and the type of vehicle that he drove that led sheriff's department investigators to at least have a suspect identified in her rape. A person of interest, if you will. They knew who Kellen Winslow was, they knew that he lived in the area, and they knew the type of vehicle that he drove. So they began their investigation. That investigation started, at least as it relates to Jane Doe 2, with a sexual assault examination. You're going to hear from the people's forensic nurse, a SANE, if you will, a sexual assault nurse examiner, who will explain to you the process by which she meets a potential victim of sexual assault. She interviews them in order to obtain a narrative of the event so that she knows what she needs to look for, and that she does a head-to-toe inspection of any potential injuries, any potential findings, and she ultimately documents them both photographically and in various diagrams. You're going to hear that the left anterior hymen in the vaginal area of Jane Doe 2 had an erythema or redness that's consistent with friction or penetration in that area. You're going to hear that anally, in the midline posterior perianal ridge, that there was also an erythema and redness consistent with penetration in that area. You're going to hear that a strangulation addendum was completed because the victim had described the choking that was done to her. She photographed that area and she documented what she said happened to her. And you're going to hear through this diagram, as you can see, the vital organs that are there in that neck area that, when restricted, can lead to significant injury or even death. And you'll hear about the way in which a dynamic act such as strangulation during the course of a forcible rape can impact an individual. You're also going to hear that the person she knew as Kevin was not Kevin, but rather Kellen Winslow, and that Jane Doe 2 identified this defendant in court in a photographic lineup during the course of the investigation, as you can see. Now we turn to Jane Doe 3. Jane Doe 3 is a woman who lives in Encinitas, near the Cardiff area. She lives on Lake Drive. She lives about 2 blocks away from where the defendant resides. That when she first met this man who would do what he did to her, he walked up, he was cycling, he was wearing cycling clothes, he parked his bike in her driveway, and he approached her and commented on the flowers that she was gardening in the front yard area. And as you can see, the photograph of the driveway area depicted in the center of that photo next to the tree is where he left his bicycle. Initially, she didn't know this person, but he was very pleasant, he was very nice. That this man introduced himself and called himself David. That he was African American, that she described he was black, that he had tattoos on his arms, that he was muscular, he was well built, and that he seemed incredibly friendly. And that when he first talked to her, he just commented on her flowers. And she said, "Oh, thank you very much. You're going to hear that she's a native Vietnamese speaker. She does not speak English very well. She may avail herself of a Vietnamese interpreter when she testifies." But that when she interacted with this person, it was in English. He introduced himself as David, he commented on her flowers, and then he asked her a question, "Are you married?" And she said, yes, I'm married. And he asked, "Is your husband home?" And she said, yes, my husband's home. And he just said, "Okay, nice to meet you. Well, I live down the street." And she knew him to be in the neighborhood. And he went on his way. Just a passing interaction. She thought nothing of it. A few weeks later, on May 24th, 2018, just 11 days after the rape of Jane Doe 2, the same man came back, again, wearing cycling clothes, on a bicycle, with a blue backpack on. He left his things in the driveway. He walked over to her. She had her back turned. She did not know he was there. She was bent over, tending to her flowers. And as you can see from these photographs, this is the front area of her home. It's enclosed by the trees. She had her back turned as she was tending to the plants that were right next to that table. As you can see, this is the area that extends from that the place of the table. And while she was gardening, he walked up behind her and surprised her, said hello again. She turned around, startled initially, then recognized him from the passing interaction they had before. And he again said, "How are you doing? Your garden is beautiful." She said, "Thank you." He asked her if her husband was home. And she said, yes, he is. But then she started to walk away from him because she really didn't know him and thought this was strange that he was coming back in the way that he had. And as she began to walk away from him, she turned as he pursued her into this area near the trees. As you can see from this perspective, this looks back towards the driveway and that table. As she sat there and turned, he was standing directly behind her. He had pulled his pants down, and he had his erect penis completely there in front of her, in his hand. And she screamed. She yelled, "No, no, 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 no. My husband, he's here." And that he just nonchalantly turned, walked away, got on his bicycle, and left. You're going to hear that she was so scared she told her husband, her husband called the police. The police came out and took a report. She's going to tell you that she was afraid of this man, that she did not know why he came to her, that she did not know if any of the things he said to her were true, and that she did not even want to look at a six-pack lineup to possibly identify the suspect. You're going to hear that she does not want to come to court because she's so afraid. She does not want to be a part of the process because of what he did to her. And she believes he's still in the same neighborhood as her. Now, you're also going to hear that her description of Mr. Winslow was consistent with the description of every other victim, and the things that he said to her corroborate his participation in this act. You're also going to hear that during the course of the sheriff's investigation into whether or not Mr. Winslow had committed each and every one of these acts, that they obtained information that showed that Mr. Winslow had been cycling that day, that he was an avid cyclist, and that there was GPS information that shows that he began to ride his bicycle that day through a Strava application right at the location where this incident had occurred, which was different from his previous pattern of beginning his rides near his home. As you can see from this overall map, 1310 Lake Drive is noted here in the bubble. As you can see, San Diego High School Academy is just along Santa Fe Drive. This is where the defendant resides. Down along Birmingham on Lake Drive is where Jane Doe 3 resides. As you will see in the exhibits that are going to be presented during the course of this trial, he began his cycling down here that day. What's interesting is you can also see that each one of the offenses that I've already discussed with you began, as you can see in the top left, along Encinitas Boulevard where the coastal station is, ended in the bottom right around Manchester Avenue, somewhat of a remote and isolated area, or began just around the corner of where Mr. Winslow resides, and then ended along here, the 5 freeway, as I said, the southbound on-ramp. All in close proximity to where Mr. Winslow lives. Now, you're also going to hear that the defendant's participation in these crimes launched a significant and substantial investigation, as I'm sure that you can imagine. You're going to hear that on June 7th, 2018, that the defendant was contacted driving his Hummer. That during the course of that contact, a reference sample of DNA was obtained from him, and that reference sample of DNA was then compared to all of the forensic evidence that had been collected over the course of the investigation at that point in time. That, as I said before, it was compared to the pants of Jane Doe 1, and it came back as a match to the sperm fraction. That it was also compared to the SARP kit that was performed on Jane Doe 2, and there was no results related to Mr. Winslow that ultimately would be consistent with her explanation of him having ejaculated outside of her into the dirt. You're also going to hear that there was, quote, minimal support for inclusion of the defendant's DNA along the side of her neck, and you will be explained, it will be explained to you what that means. The DNA analyst will be testifying as early as tomorrow regarding Jane Doe 1's pants, and she will be testifying again as it relates to the SARP examination of Jane Doe 2. Now, this case does not end there, because as I said, a search warrant was done at his residence. His vehicle was seized, and further forensic testing was done within his vehicle. You're going to hear that the processing of his vehicle was extensive. You'll hear that no blood was detected within the front passenger seat area, that no DNA of our victims was left behind, and that will be explained to you by the analysts, what touch DNA is and what that means, and whether or not DNA, as a result of touching an item, will leave behind a sufficient amount to be detected. You're also going to hear that during the processing of that Hummer, that took place after the defendant's contact with police the first week of June. And that the day after the defendant's contact with police where the reference sample was obtained, that the defendant began to try to cover his tracks. That the defendant had his Hummer detailed, that the defendant sold his Hummer to an auto broker, and that it was ultimately seized after the defendant had tried to get rid of it. You're going to hear that it was still forensically processed. And what did they find? They found that in the rear portion, the rear passenger portion, back seat of the defendant's vehicle, they found sperm fractions that came back to the defendant that he had left behind. Now, that processing will be discussed extensively by the various analysts who were involved, to the crime scene specialists. You're also going to hear that a search warrant was executed at his home, 1310 Lake Drive, an absolutely beautiful location, an absolutely beautiful home where he resides with his family. And you're going to hear that numerous items were seized from his home, including a blue backpack, a cycling backpack that's consistent with the description given by Jane Doe 3. You will also hear that surveillance systems that were contained there, some of them were cloud-based, so that the actual hardware that had been recovered would not contain the actual surveillance itself, but that there is a portion within the date range of Jane Doe 1's incident where surveillance was found. Where surveillance was found where the defendant left on his own in his black hardtop Hummer around 2:30 that afternoon. That the defendant's wife and children were still at home. That he returned shortly before 5 p.m., around 4:50 p.m. that day, again alone in his Hummer, as his wife and children also returned home and greeted him. All within the time frame that Jane Doe 1 says this incident occurred. And you're going to hear that as a result of the investigation and the numerous victims who had come forward and described in detail what this man had done, that another victim came forward. That after this defendant had been arrested and arraigned on charges, and there was, as you can imagine, as you sit there today, significant media attention as a result, that across the country, Jane Doe 4, a military wife married to a Marine staff sergeant, called the police. She came forward and said that she too had something taken from her by this defendant. That she too had been victimized. Only it had been many years prior. And that she had stayed silent because she didn't know if anyone would believe her, and she knew who he was and what that would mean for her if she came forward. But that she did make the decision to come forward because she had seen what he had done, and she was shocked and traumatized as a result. That she then knew that he hadn't changed his ways, and this wasn't just an isolated incident for her back in 2003 as a high school senior, but instead that he had continued his ways and committed the same crimes against others. And you're going to hear that she reached out to a friend who still lived in San Diego, a friend who had been there the night of her rape back in June of 2003. And Jane Doe 4 will come before you and she will testify about what he did to her, the impact it had on her, the reasons why she never reported it, and then the reasons why she did. She's going to tell you that that friend of hers, Nicole Edwards, immediately upon Jane Doe 4 reaching out to her and saying, "Oh my God, did you see the news? Did you see what he did?" The first response from Nicole was, "Yes, I saw that. I can't believe we never said anything." You're going to hear that Jane Doe 4, when she was 17 years old, had met the defendant through mutual friends at a house party in the Scripps Ranch area of San Diego. That she believed he was in college at that time. He was 19. He had already begun his football career and academic career at the University of Miami. That he was home for the summer. That in June of 2003, they had gone on the graduation party circuit. They would go to a house party in one place. Sometimes that would get broken up. They would go to a house party in another place. She was doing what teenagers did. She and Nicole were close friends and did this frequently. They'd go to different parties just as anyone would in high school. And she's going to tell you that through a mutual friend, she met the defendant. That she thought he was attractive. She thought he was good looking. She thought he was nice. She's going to tell you that she drank a couple beers that first night that she had met him. And then she was taken back to a house with others there, other teenagers, and then she had sex with him in the bedroom. And that first time that she met him while having sex with him, some others wanted to join in and Kellen asked her if she was okay with that as other people came into the bedroom. She said no. And he stopped. And it was over. 2 weeks later, she ran into him again at another party. She had drinking some beer. As you'll hear, she's quite diminutive. She's very short. She's very light, less than 100 pounds at the time. And that she was feeling the effects of alcohol, feeling a little tipsy, but that she was not completely drunk. She sees the defendant. She talks with him. They make arrangements to leave one party. They go to another. They have a rendezvous with some friends, and they part ways. As she rode with the defendant in his black SUV. You're going to hear that the defendant did have a large SUV GMC that was registered to him at that time. And this photograph was taken that very night. The night that the defendant would take something from her. They went back to a townhouse or a home in Encinitas, or pardon me, Scripps Ranch. When they got to that house, she says that the first thing she did is she went into a bathroom. And she remembers trying to get it together. She splashed water on her face because she was feeling a little disoriented. That the defendant was there. That a person named Matt was there. That the defendant's friend, Chris Resto, had been there earlier in the night when they first met up and they parted ways. And what she recalls happening is sitting on a couch on her own while Matt and the defendant were in a kitchen. She believes they may have been drinking. And as she sat on that couch, she lost consciousness. Her next waking memory was face down in a bed, in a bedroom, being raped from behind. Feeling the force of the defendant inside of her, on top of her. She came to with her face being pushed by the defendant's hand into the exposed crotch area of Matt. As she came to and realized what was happening, she began to protest. And she remembers saying no, 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 repeatedly. But the defendant did not stop. He continued to rape her. She could tell that Matt saw that she was protesting. And Matt got up and tried to stop the defendant, but he did not. The defendant now forcibly continued to rape her. Finally, Matt convinced the defendant to stop, so he did. And the victim, lying there, naked, hurt, afraid, heard the defendant say, "Why, she's just a stupid bitch anyway." And the defendant left. What the victim remembers happening then was Matt helping her with her clothes and carrying her to a car. She believes it was a BMW, and being driven from the house to a place where she met with Chris and her friend Nicole. And when she met with Chris and Nicole, she was put into Nicole's vehicle. Nicole drove her away. She remembers hearing Matt and Chris talking about what had happened. Chris saying something to the effect of, "This will ruin him." And Matt asking her on the drive, "Were you raped? Were you raped?" And she remembers riding with Nicole, crying, sobbing, and telling Nicole, "I kept saying no. I said no." You're going to hear from Nicole Edwards as well. He's going to have a different memory of how exactly this happened, but the memory of Jane Doe Ford telling her that Kellen Winslow raped her remains, and that she will be able to confirm and corroborate that. You're also going to hear from Nicole Edwards about the way in which Jane Doe Ford reached out to her and the text messages that were sent between the two of them once Jane Doe Ford had made her decision to come forward. You're also going to hear from Jane Doe Ford's husband, the father of her children, who will tell you that years prior to any media attention for other rapes committed at the hands of the defendant, that his wife had told him that when she was a 17-year-old senior in high school, that she had been raped at a house party by a person named Kellen. He did not know who that was, had no idea. You'll also hear from a prior boyfriend of Jane Doe number 4, who will tell you that approximately a year or two after this happened in June of 2003, that he had met the victim, who had since moved to Hawaii and had been residing there. Only a month after this incident happened, she moved away. And then when she met her, there were repeated times where she would clearly exhibit signs of trauma. She would have nightmares. She would be upset. And he had disclosed she had disclosed to him also that she had been raped by this defendant. Those prior statements will be available to you to determine the truth and veracity of what she tells you happened. Now, you're also going to hear that after everything that the defendant had done with Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2 and Jane Doe 3, and after it had come to light what he had done with Jane Doe 4, just a few short months ago, this defendant continued to take from another woman. In February of this year, Jane Doe 5 was at the Crunch Fitness in El Camino Real in Carlsbad. It was an afternoon. There weren't many people that were there, the middle of the business day. That she was on the second floor area of the gym. That this woman and her husband regularly went at that same time, 3 days a week. That she was alone on the second floor area, no one else was within sight, and that she was exercising. When the defendant walked up the stairs, saw where she was, and walked over and began to use the machines nearby her. That there was a point in time where he sat on a machine very close by where she was. That as she looked over, she began to get nervous because it seemed like he was looking at her, which seemed strange to her. She did not know who he was. She had never seen him before. But that she did see that he was touching himself and rubbing his genital area while looking in her direction. She tried not to look. She didn't know what he was doing. She was somewhat afraid, but really more offended and surprised. She was going through her regular workout routine, and at a point even confronted him and said, "Are you done with that machine?" And he got up and he moved. And she sat on the machine and she continued her workout. And there was a point where the defendant then, now with a fully erect penis, stood within feet of her and began to thrust his hips forward as though he was stretching in some way, and he asked her, with his erect penis directly in front of her, "Do you see that? Do you like that?" And she just said, "What did you say to me?" And he turned, almost as though he was startled that she would react in that way, and walked away. She didn't report it to the gym employees at that point in time, but she did tell her husband what had happened. She waited until she and her husband were in the car because her husband, also an elderly man, she was worried about him. She was worried that her husband would get hot-headed and confront the guy. And she knew that this defendant, this man in court, well-built, strong, athletic, she was worried about what would happen to her husband if her husband knew in that moment. She convinced her husband not to say anything, and they didn't. She thought it would never happen again. She was wrong. Because a couple weeks later, the defendant targeted her again. This time, on February 22nd of this year, she was in a jacuzzi at the same Crunch Fitness by herself in the pool area. And she was sitting in that jacuzzi, relaxing after her workout, expecting her husband to come and join her, as was their regular routine. As she sat in that jacuzzi, she will describe to you what the defendant did next. He walked out of the men's locker room area, the premier members. He walked out, looked at her, they made eye contact, and she immediately recognized him as the person who had stroked himself and asked her if she liked it before. that he looked at her, got a drink of water at the water fountain, and then went back into the locker room. She could see through the tinted glass on the window as she sat there concerned about seeing this man again, that he was disrobing, and he emerged from the locker room wearing nothing but a hand towel that is provided by the gym to wipe down the equipment, not the shower towels that would be full size and actually cover the entire area. That he held in his hand a backpack and swim trunks in his hand and walked towards her. She tried to divert her attention because she could tell the way that the towel was around his waist was not going to cover everything. But as he walked down towards the jacuzzi again, she sat there alone, he looked at her, put down the backpack and the trunks from his hand, and pointed at the trunks while looking at her. He then walked into the jacuzzi. She turned away because she knew that as soon as he walked into that jacuzzi in such close proximity, she would see his genital area. As she turned away, he came and sat down almost directly next to her in the jacuzzi. And she just stared away because she was so scared. And hoping her husband would come, she didn't want to create a confrontation. As she sat there, she turned and saw as the defendant began to motion below the water, below the bubbles as they were on, as the jets were on, that he unmistakably, according to her, unmistakably was masturbating next to her. That his arm was moving in a motion below the water, that he was stroking his genital, that he was stroking his penis. And she froze. This large, intimidating man next to her who had already asked her the question, do you like that? Do you see that? And she froze with fear. You're going to hear that while he was doing that, he reached out and grabbed her arm. That she felt him touch her arm. And she pulled it away. You're going to hear that while he continued to do that, he then made contact with her foot, with his foot. And she turned to him and said, is that your fucking foot? She's a feisty woman, as you'll see. And he then just responded with, what do we do when the jets go off? Something to that effect. You're going to hear that in that moment when he spoke, she came to. She realized what's going on. That in that moment, she also saw that there was another person now who had entered the jacuzzi and was across the way. You're going to hear that her husband then emerged from the men's locker room, and she saw him. And she got up. She got out. She went over to him. She told her husband what had just happened. And her husband looked over and saw this defendant sitting in the jacuzzi. Saw this defendant then go into the locker room. And that they went and they reported it to the gym employees together. You're going to hear that the Crunch Fitness employees did what they do in scenarios when there's reported criminality. That they reported it through the corporate chain, and that ultimately the Crunch Fitness General Counsel referred it to the Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department, Carlsbad PD, conducted their investigation and went and contacted Jane Doe number 5 and her husband and the gym employees who were witnesses. And that over the course of that investigation, it showed also that this defendant, Kellen Winslow, was the man who was in that jacuzzi. He was the man who had asked her if she liked it after touching his penis. You're going to hear that there's GPS location data that shows that this defendant was at that Crunch Fitness on those days. You're going to hear that there are gym entry and exit records that show the victim was there at the same time as this defendant. Again, this defendant committed these acts. Now, as a result, the entirety of the investigation, and as you can see, it was extensive. There is a significant amount of information that you're going to hear over the next couple of weeks. But ultimately, this man who was given so much, this man who chose to take from so many, for whatever reason he chose, he decided that what he had wasn't enough. For whatever reason he chose to target these women. Ultimately, it is in your hands to judge this man by his deeds and not who he is. Because a man's deeds, whether they be good or whether they be evil, are what you as jurors must decide. I'm confident that as a result of the presentation of evidence in this case, that you will find this defendant guilty of all crimes and allegations that have been brought, counts 1 through 12.
All right, thank you, Mr. Owens. At this time, we're going to take our mid-morning recess. Please remember the admonition, don't discuss the case with anybody or form or express any opinions. We will see you back here in 15 minutes. 15 minutes.